What if you took 3dfx's Voodoo 2, injected a 2D display engine, and stuck it on an AGP bus? Well, in the latter part of 1998, that's exactly what 3dfx set out to do, with a new chip that seemed to check all the right boxes. The result, however, would be one of the most divisive graphics cards in the company's history, and one that to this day is still met with mixed feelings, if not outright derision. This is PixelPipes. This is the Voodoo Banshee, 3dfx's compact offering for the mid-range market in 1998. With it came a slew of innovations, a number of firsts for the company, and a handful of nifty advantages. Unfortunately, the upsides came counterbalanced with some pretty sizable downsides that many couldn't overlook. It's a tragically underappreciated card in my opinion, and in this video we'll explore why the Voodoo Banshee was so unloved. So as usual, let's start with a little background. Almost all of my regular viewers will be familiar with 3dfx's first entry into the 3D accelerator market, which, at the risk of sounding redundant, was known simply as Voodoo Graphics. In 1996, this was indisputably the fastest in the market, and most of 3dfx's competitors spent the entirety of 1997 simply trying to catch up to, if not maybe even exceed, its performance, with very few actually managing to do so. Unlike the blistering speed of their first product, 3dfx as a company admittedly didn't move very fast after their initial splash, with their only new product in 1997, the Voodoo Rush, being really just a quickly cobbled together mashup of their graphics chipset with a couple varieties of off-the-shelf 2D solutions that were available at the time. It wasn't nearly as well received as their standalone 3D accelerator, and competitors like ATI and Nvidia were producing ably performing cards with their 2D functionality built right into a single chip. 1998 would finally see the release of a true successor to the original Voodoo graphics, the aptly named Voodoo 2. But once again, their pursuit for the best possible performance meant they'd stick with a multi-chip design and leave the 2D acceleration to the choice of the user. This worked just fine for the enthusiast sector, but it left the OEM pre-built market in the cold. Nvidia and ATI were raking in business from companies like Dell and Gateway, with products like the Riva 128 or Rage Pro. And whether or not they offered the best performance, having an all-in-one graphics solution that was cheaper and easier for the average consumer to use was worth the compromise for system builders. This was an important sector that 3dfx was losing out on, and they needed to act. The Voodoo Banshee was their much needed response, and it would bring with it a number of innovations and firsts for 3D effects, starting with the fact that it was a single chip graphics solution that offered near cutting edge 3D performance paired with a top of the line 2D component. This time around they'd eschewed the use of a run-of-the-mill third-party 2D chipset in favor of an in-house developed 2D display engine, and they had no intention of cutting any corners. The Banshee's 2D display acceleration would be among the fastest in the industry, with a 128-bit GUI core and 128-bit VISA VVE 3.0 support. It would handle a maximum resolution of 1920 by 1440 with 32-bit colors, as well as single-cycle block writing, full 256 raster operations, tertiary with functions, hardware polygon generation, Bresenham line drawing, and various other nonsensical 2D word salad I won't pretend to fully understand. The long and short is, it was good, and reviewers of the time attested to that. It would also satisfy a demand from system builders to support the new AGP interface, though really only on the surface. AGP support was limited to 1x speed, equivalent to 66 MHz PCI mode, as it didn't support any native AGP features such as AGP texturing or sideband addressing. As such, it didn't see much, if any, benefit from using AGP aside from physical compatibility, and PCI versions were made readily available with no tangible loss to performance. The Banshee came equipped with up to 16 MB of memory, the largest VRAM capacity of any 3DFX card at the time. In fact, the memory architecture was entirely different from past Voodoo cards. Both the Voodoo and Voodoo 2 treated their memory as separate banks, strictly reserved for either textures or the frame buffer, depending on which chip the bank was connected to. The Banshee was the first 3DFX card to unify its memory, and could dynamically allocate any amount for either the textures or frame buffer. This actually gave it an advantage in 3D acceleration over a single Voodoo 2 in being able to support render resolutions beyond 800 by 600. I've actually had it up to 1280 by 1024 without issues, although 1600 by 1200 starts to get a bit wonky. What's more, thanks to its integrated 2D acceleration, it was the first 3DFX card to support windowed mode rendering. In some ways, it seemed like something of a successor to the Voodoo 2, refining and adding to the features of an already venerable graphics card. The Banshee could even perform better in some cases, with stock clocks at 100 MHz giving it a higher pixel fill rate compared to a reference Voodoo 2 clocked at 90 MHz. Its memory could even be clocked independently from its core, a unique trait that no other 3DFX product would have. But its performance advantages were limited in scope. The Voodoo 2's biggest claim to fame was its second texture mapping unit, which was 3DFX's in-hardware response to the demands of next-generation games utilizing multi-texturing effects, such as the light maps in Quake 2. With the second TMU, the Voodoo 2 could apply two textures to a surface in a single clock cycle, giving it a significant speed advantage in such cases. The Voodoo Banshee had no such leverage. To save on transistors, the second TMU was removed from the design, harkening back to the older style single texturing architecture of the original Voodoo. In games that used multi-texturing, multiple clock cycles were needed to complete the effect, slowing down the rendering time. This meant newer games were typically slower on the Banshee compared to a reference Voodoo 2, but older games with only single texture polygons were actually faster, a claim to fame that admittedly received little fanfare given that most gamers weren't looking to play those older style games. But compared to the competition, the Banshee was still a formidable card, and an appealing alternative to products such as the Matrox G200 or S3 Savage 3D. Between $100 to $120, it was considerably cheaper than high-end offerings such as Nvidia's Riva TNT at around $200, and of course the Voodoo 2 at $300. Playing games with a Voodoo Banshee on a period-correct Pentium II machine generally yields enjoyable results. Quake 3 is a game that famously relies on multi-texturing to achieve what was then impressive lighting in its maps. With light maps enabled, the Banshee suffers disruptive slowdowns in many situations, especially with lots of weapon fire. This is even with the resolution dropped down to the minimum 640 by 480. With just vertex lighting, the frame rate roughly doubles, though with a considerable hit to the look of the game. But Quake 2 runs considerably smoother as you might expect, even at 1024 by 768, and it runs one of my personal favorites, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, with fantastically smooth frame rates at that resolution as well. Putting the PCI version of the Banshee in a K6-2 Plus machine running at 600 MHz, we can see Unreal running very playably at max settings with a resolution of 800 by 600. Again, this is a game that heavily used multi-texturing effects, prodding at the main weakness of the card, but nonetheless you would have had a fun experience in this game. Unreal Tournament is a little more intense, and although mostly playable at 800 by 600, you might prefer a smoother frame rate in an arena shooter like this one. And as you can see, the expendable demo runs pretty smooth on the PCI Banshee, also running at 800 by 600. So on the whole, it seemed like a pretty great option in 1998. Or at least, you'd think so, but looking back at the reception the Voodoo Banshee received, it's clear that it wasn't 3DFX's most popular product, at least amongst enthusiasts. Criticisms ranged from the lack of the second texture unit crippling performance to claims of poor driver support, or that better options were available for the money. To be fair, it wouldn't take long for the Riva TNT to come way down in price, with the launch of its successor, the TNT II, the following year. And to many, it seemed like the Banshee was a product created for a very short window of time. Once its time had passed, it was no longer the appealing product that 3DFX had intended. With the launch of the Voodoo 3 series in 1999, 3DFX introduced the budget range of Velocity cards to fill the gap below the higher-end models. The Velocity cards effectively took the place of the Banshee, with two models to choose from, and once it was discovered you could unlock even more performance from them in Glide and OpenGL with a simple registry added, they became the favorite for Voodoo fans on a tight spending limit. But without the Banshee, there would be no Voodoo 3. 3DFX created its first in-house 2D engine for this card, and it was that same engine that would power the 2D acceleration of all subsequent generations. And 3D-wise, the Banshee carried with it the same underlying architecture as the much-loved Voodoo 2, with a myriad of advantages and disadvantages. You got all the same graphical features and potentially even better image quality, since you weren't having to use an external VGA dongle going to a separate 2D display card. It was fast and convenient to use back in its day, and a great pairing for any late 90s retro machine. There's honestly a lot to like about the Voodoo Banshee, and it's my hope that after watching this video, many of you will start to see it that way as well. Thanks for watching. As a sort of addendum, I have to say this video was one of the more time-consuming videos I've ever made, and though I originally intended to include benchmarks for my own testing, I wasted way too many weeks just trying to get my test platform up and running, with a long string of ridiculous setbacks clogging up production. Ultimately, I decided to just focus on the history and user experience of the card, and I hope you found it enjoyable nonetheless. This has been my entry for GP June 2, and I encourage you to check out the playlist in the description down below for more great content during this month-long celebration of GPUs. I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.